this will encourage you any. I think it's cooler up here than it is downstairs, if that helps anyone. Tonight we have a rather tricky subject, so I suppose we might as well dive into it and hope that the warmth of the evening will not cause too much psychic fatigue at this time. We are working this evening to determine, if possible, the processes of the subconscious mind in relation to man, and as I termed it, nature, by which we mean those forms of life in which intelligence is possible, but which are not human, according to our understanding. In the last 25 years, we have tried to be very objective on the subject of the human mental activity. And the most concise statement to summarize the general conclusion is that mental activity is now regarded as a form of motion, that it is tied with the concept of movement, and that therefore thinking is a kind of qualitative motion, not from a place to a place, although thought may direct bodily motion from a place to a place. But in itself, thought is a motion from a condition to a condition, from a previous state to a present exertion toward a subsequent condition. If, therefore, we regard the possibility of thought process being a process of motion, how does it differ from every other motion that we know in nature? Well, we observe that that kind of motion, which we term intelligence or intellectual motion, seems to be eccentric in one particular. Instinct can cause things to infinitely repeat themselves. But when, in the process of motion, from a previous toward a subsequent state, the moving object or the moving being is subjected to a crisis, to an unexpected or an unusual condition, then we begin to see traces of true mentation. Thus, we have come to assume that the mental processes are most easily distinguished when habitual procedures become inadequate and the individual is suddenly confronted by something new, by a problem not previously solved, or one certainly unexpected in the situation in which it arises. We immediately observe that under such conditions, the individual is capable of a kind of activity by which he increases the total intellectual substance of himself. He is able to do that which previously he could not do, or shall we say, previously he had not done, and about the doing of which he was previously unaware. Thus, emergency, or the challenge of the new and the unusual, these most clearly reflect and reveal the existence in man of a creating, solving, intellectual power or faculty. The question then naturally arises, is such a faculty evident or present elsewhere in nature? If mentation is associated with motion, if it is in some way a flowing, and motion itself is purposed, and we must assume that motion is purposed, movement has to have reason. It has to fulfill a requirement, meet a need, express a desire. Things do not move simply for the sake of moving. They are moved for purposes or for reasons. And the Greeks began to study the substance of motion, to distinguish between the types of movement that could be noticed as things self-moved or things not self-moved, or things apparently motionless in the midst of motion. About the latter group, the Greeks themselves had serious misgivings. They doubted if anything was actually immovable, unless it might be deity itself, which could be immovable because inhabiting all dimensions, there was no direction in which it could move, being total life in itself. But if motion is in some way a proof of the presence of intellectual energy, then may we not advance the possibility that all motion, whether it be in animate things or inanimate things, reveals a certain amount of intelligence. The French Academy in the last century sought to discover the nature and substance of intelligent energy, and they finally came to the conclusion that energy did show certain rudimentary forms of intelligence. If we wish to assume that the materialist has a strong case, and that we can no longer depend upon spiritual overtones to explain man, then man's intellectual life must arise in his energy field. Intellect must be in some way a production of energy or a production of motion. Now we observe that in motion, all things moving are governed by laws of their kind. The flight of the bird is not merely an accident or an incident. The flight of the bird is the result of the coordination of innumerable factors. The bird is constructed in a way in which its flight is possible. It instinctively and inevitably becomes consciously aware of its own flight possibility. And whether it has any thought about the subject, we do not know. But at least it instinctively flies. And that there has to be a certain education involving mind potential would seem likely from the fact that the parent birds have to teach the young birds to fly, and that the bird resists this education to a degree and must gradually be indoctrinated with the rudiments of the kind of life to which it belongs before it assumes the full responsibility for flying, which is its natural right. Also, we find that all types of creatures, we can say, possess instinct. But this instinct, in most instances, is more than the mere repetitive process of doing what has always been done. Most animals can react to emergency. Most animals show, if only to a rudimentary degree, the possibility of personal solution to problems. Perhaps they have to be heavily indoctrinated before this is possible. Certainly they do not as immediately rationalize as man does. But experiments with various types of animals, even reptiles and fowls, have indicated that these creatures can be taught. And they can be taught largely by the most common inducement that nature has, and that is the inducement for food. Thus, most creatures will learn to solve the riddle of how to supply themselves with the food necessary to live. And under the tremendous stimulus of need, they will develop ingenious capacities and abilities to gain this food. Experiments in comparative psychology have shown that birds, animals, reptiles, rodents are very easily taught certain procedures. Now, the psychologist points out that while the animal or reptile or bird can be taught, it then establishes a kind of habit pattern and will usually abide by that pattern, lacking originality or lacking the ability to work through the type of equation which distinguishes the human mind. There is, however, evidence to sustain the belief that in the animal kingdom there are advanced types, and that these types can gradually be trained or can be unfolded by various inducements until they reveal many of the mental aptitudes, abilities, and thought powers associated with the normal life of man, and can be given an intellectual existence equivalent to a 6 to 8-year-old human child. Therefore, we cannot say that the intellectual faculty is entirely absent. Now, when we start working with less animate things, let us take almost any kind of structure you wish to consider. For example, plant life, which is still, however, more or less animate. But let's go back to minerals and the cleavage of crystals. In this procedure, there is a definite indication of law and order. We would be very unhappy indeed if any of the reasonable patterns of consistency upon which we have learned to depend should suddenly be reversed. The falling object reaching the ground, the experiments of Galileo with the pendulum, the various motions of the heavenly bodies, the inclination of the earth's axis, all of these kinds of things play a very large part in our lives, whether we know it or not. And we would be greatly dismayed if any of these procedures suddenly became eccentric or departed from their reasonable probabilities. We could be in serious trouble almost immediately if water did not consistently run downhill. This situation, however, has to do with motion. Now, what is it that prevents many of these motions from becoming eccentric? Presumably, the interaction of various factors. These factors working together seem to bind a particular form of life into a structure from which it cannot escape. Actually, however, we have no way of being certain that nearly every so-called lawful process in nature, any consistent methodology with which we are acquainted, any procedure that goes on through the ages, filling us with confidence that it will indefinitely continue, any such procedure may very well imply a motion with intelligence. We do not know that it does not. We assume that it does not. And we are against another subject of difficulty, even to the psychologist, although he is beginning to sense its implications. The only thing we can seek for in estimating the intelligence of other forms of life is the kind of intelligence which we ourselves possess. It is conceivable that there are other entirely different types of intelligence, that the tests of our intelligence may not exhaust that which can be considered the true expression of intellect, that what we have is a highly conditioned form of intelligence we know. And as we study it more and more, we realize something else, namely that gradually what we call intelligence has been conditioned perhaps from an original pattern of instinct. Today, the intelligence of the average human being is not strictly his own. His intelligence is derived from a variety of factors and circumstances moving in upon him. For example, his intelligence might be seriously injured if his memory failed him. And yet memory and intelligence cannot be regarded as identical. What we call intelligence is often merely the folk way of solving a situation or problem. Less and less are we actually required to express individual intelligence. Thus we live in a comparative security resulting from common processes which we share together and about which we have a broad acceptance without understanding. Deprive man of all of these additional outside modifying conditions and block out of him the memory of them, leaving him only with a primordial group of faculties with which to work. And it is quite certain that his reflexes might not be at all what we assume they will be today. Thus, intelligence to us is schooled, trained, and educated. It is influenced by propaganda, advertising, promotion. Our minds are subtly, constantly impregnated with ideas that are not really our own and about which perhaps we have very slight true knowledge. We see this more and more with the gradual disappearance of individuality. The great struggle of the person today is to retain his own individual position in mental existence. And he is having ever greater difficulty doing this. He is finding heavy penalizations on such procedure. The easy, the inexpensive, the efficient way to live today is in complete conformity with broad patterns of acceptance. This conformity is not true thinking. It is not really very different from instinct. Instinct perhaps arises in the blood of things. Conformity in the experience of things. Instinct may be a pressure from within us, but conformity is a pressure from around us. And it is difficult to say whether instinct or this pressure constitutes the more lawful cause or dynamic behind activity. We must, generally speaking, accept the fact that the average person thinks only in emergency and gradually protects himself more and more against such emergencies as may cause thinking. Thus, in matters of originality, we have always a poverty in times where intellectual energy is not individually developed. We are style conscious. We are habit conscious. We allow other people to make up our minds in almost every detail for us. Perhaps this is a kind of collective thinking, but if so, what does it actually amount to? Is it essentially different from the collective type of thinking which perhaps made certain social existence possible to the savage, and also, as instinct, perhaps still dominates a large part of the animal and plant worlds? We know that plants have a certain ability to discriminate, to sense value, and that, among other things, they will struggle desperately to reach light, to reach nutrition, or to survive by adjustment to very difficult situations. Thus, survival, in one way or another, seems to drive all things on. And the primary motion in nature is the motion towards survival, towards continuance. a will to live. Now, can a creature totally without mentation have the instinct to survive? This has been a very moot question. Whether, for instance, the little vine that struggles out of the dark cave and finally manages to throw one feeble branch into the light where it can secure a necessary form of life, does this little plant know that it is striving to live? Perhaps it does not know. If it does not know, is this important? Does the fact that it does not know its own motive detract from the intellectual validity of the action? If so, where does this leave man? How many human beings know what they think with? How many human beings can actually give an absolute definition of mind? None up to the present time. How does any individual explain his own thought processes? How much do we know about the basic and rudimentary motives or instincts or impulses which we seek to gratify? The plant, struggling to orient itself in an unhelpful or almost impossible situation, struggles to survive. We say it isn't intelligent because it doesn't know why it is struggling. Man is struggling to survive. Does man know why he is struggling? If you had to sit down today and decide in your own consciousness why you are doing what you are doing today in terms of a long-range purpose that is important, what would your own conclusions be? Would you have any reason that you could give for your immediate struggle to live a little longer? Why do you want to live a little longer? Is there anything important that you are doing? Is there any important reason for your continuance? You are seeking perhaps to do some common good. As a nation, we want to live a little longer. Why? What is the average American citizen's vision of what he can do toward the condition of his country 100 years from now? Has he any concept of such thinking? Or is he living completely in a series of motions, the substance and essence of which he does not understand very much better than other more primitive forms of life? Man can talk about these things more volubly than any other creature. But having talked, has he said anything? And if he does say anything, does he know what he is saying? These questions affect psychological thinkers and, by extension, philosophical thinkers, because as yet there's been no way of successfully differentiating between psychology and philosophy, and we sincerely hope they will never find one, because without philosophy to give it purpose and meaning, psychology will never solve the enigma of the human mind with which it is so profoundly concerned. The ancients were not aware of our utilitarian perspective on things, but they also had certain essential concepts which they held to be valid. To ancient man, particularly I'm thinking of the classical Greek culture at the moment, mind was a kind of psychic entity. Mind was a being. Mind was not merely a condition of physical energy. Mind was not a byproduct of function. Mind was a superior kind of creature inhabiting a body. The Greeks represented this in several ways. They conceived at the root of things the existence of a universal mind. And this universal mind they regarded, if not as deity, at least as one of the primary attributes of divinity itself. The universal thinker was the demiurgus, or formator of the worlds. A universal mind moving from itself, accomplished all of the works of creation purposefully. These works were according to the mind of God, according to the will of God. There was at the root of all life intellectual purpose. The nature of this purpose might not be immediately available to man. It was not given man that he could read the mind of God, but it was given to divine mind that it could know the workings of the parts of itself. Therefore, while man could not fully understand God, God, representing the totality of mind, could understand or accept or differentiate, rationalize concerning the infinite diversity of creatures within its own substance or composed of its own nature. Thus, a mind apart from matter, but forming a partnership with matter under certain conditions, was to a large degree the classical man's approach to the psychological problem. And as we go on today, digging more deeply into mental phenomena, we are becoming more conscious of its profundity, less inclined to regard it merely as an incidental part of physical phenomena. Even the modern psychologist of the Western school, who is not particularly given to abstractions, has become amazed and intrigued at the dimensions and proportions of the mental universe. He is discovering, for example, that whereas he thought the physical world was a great and wonderful place with almost infinite opportunity for research and consideration and, unfortunately, for exploitation, he has discovered that the mental world, as it is unfolding to his consciousness today, is infinitely greater than the physical world, that it has infinitely greater potentials, that instead of it merely being a fragment of something, it is far more complete, far more all-embracing than the physical life with which he has previously been concerned. It is now dawning upon him more and more that physical existence is the consequence of mind in action. Instead of the mind being a byproduct of irritation and the cerebral nervous system, what we call mind is really the cause of the nervous system. That behind physical matter is this tremendous impulse, a rational, reasonable, conscious impulse. That this impulse projects body. That evolution is not the growth of form, but the growth of mind through form. That growth is not really merely the expansion of body, but the unfolding or ideating of energy. That the plant that is unfolding its leaves is bearing witness to flowing energies. That everything that we have previously regarded as purely physical is suspended from a life principle. And psychology has become intrigued with the possibility that this life principle is best understood as mind. Unfortunately, however, we are at another impasse. We are moving in the right direction, but we are too much inclined to love the idea of finality. Each new discovery we make is ultimate, and we have to reform and revise our thinking periodically. Even though we finally lift the veil of matter and discover mind, we must yet lift the veil of mind, because we certainly have not come to the end of our search for these sovereign realities that are at the root of existence. Mind explains many things, but the more we explore mind, the more we realize we need something else which will explain mind. At the moment, we're not too concerned with this because we're having too much trouble and too much excitement analyzing mind. But by degrees, we come into the continuous realization that mind can also be sick. And we have a new perspective the idea of the mind being responsible for many of the forms of sickness that we have previously assumed originated in the body, and that health is more a psychosomatic problem than we've ever previously realized. If, therefore, we assume that mind can be distorted, can be sick, we come a little bit in the direction of Buddhism. We come to Buddha's basic affirmation or thought, namely that you cannot trust mind any more than you can trust body as a solution to all mysteries. We really believe that when we understood body, we would understand man. This has not proven to be true. We now finally hope that when we understand mind, we can explain man. This will not be true. When we understood body, we explained body and needed something else. When we understand mind, we will explain mind and need something else. And this has always been the human experience in the search of knowledge. Actually, at the moment, we are already beginning to sense that mentalism as a science, that this science of attributing everything to mental phenomena, is beginning to weaken, that it is already showing distinct indications of insufficiency. We are gradually being forced to come back to the old terms that we hoped to discard long ago. We have to begin to think now of the possibility of a spirit or a consciousness behind mind. We have to realize that if mind can be sick, that the health of the mind must be assured by something superior to itself. That if the mind can be caused to depart from law and order, then the mind is not law and order. If the mind is capable of deviation from the reasonable, then the mind and the reason cannot be regarded as identical. If the mind can disobey truth, then mind is not aware fully of the nature of truth. And truth itself is greater than the mind. We have already come to the rather distressing opinion that with the mind we are not going to discover truth, for the reason that it lacks the faculties and the experience breadths and depths by which it can experience totality. And what it cannot experience, it cannot know or define. Thus the mind becomes again a link or a stepping stone to something else. We have to go further and deeper in our search for the true explanation of things. In the quest, however, for a solution to our mental life, several schools of psychology have come into existence, each with somewhat different attitudes, each with somewhat different findings. And these differences themselves remind us that where difference of opinion can exist, absolute fact is not yet attained. For had we actually the truth, we could no longer be in a state of uncertainty or conflict or opinion. The reason we are in opinion is that the fact is not actually commonly available to us. The various types of consciousness with which we have gradually come to be concerned may be divided in several ways. We'll use one very simple division now, which will serve the present purposes adequately. We can say we have a conscious mind. That is a mind that is focused on the level of objective awareness. It is the kind of mind in which there is no mystery. Or at least there is only one mystery and we never worry about it. And that is the mystery of why it's there in the first place. But the common conscious mind is that with which we can reasonably explain things. It is the mind with which we commonly know things. It is the mind with which we daily live. There is nothing too mysterious about it. For instance, we have a certain attitude. We wonder why we have the attitude, and the moment we wonder, we realize that we read it in the paper or that a friend told us, and we know how we came to possess this particular opinion. Or we can trace the functions of this mind to adequate antecedent causes. And we also can assume with reasonable certainty that its consequences will be consistent with its present directives. Thus we have no mystery, no great problem. But then there is another part of mind with which we are not nearly so familiar. And that is a mind which seemingly locked within us and below the threshold of our common experience seems to throw constant pressures into our lives. This kind of mind is full of mystery because it causes us to do things we do not understand and often to do things we do not want to do. It contains within itself depths which we cannot easily fathom and frequently results in temperamental personality problems which almost frighten us. It is in this part of thinking that we suddenly realize that we do not know why we do what we do. We do not know the moment in which some further excess, some unexpected, even terrible thing may arise within us. But there is a kind of thinking which we cannot control, which arises spontaneously within us. And that this thinking is, for the most part, somewhat less on a moral and ethical level than our common conscious thought, as we are generally aware of it. We have a good many examples of this, and in this particular problem, psychological and